I'm Don Sol, a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management and co-founder of CultureX, and joined by my co-founder and co-host, Charlie. Today, we're delighted to speak with Kunal Kapoor, the CEO of Morningstar. So Kunal, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Don. Happy to be here.
So many of you will be familiar with Morningstar as a kind of top of the line source of data for investors. I know all of my students will be familiar with Morningstar because I'm always urging them to use it. But you may not be quite as familiar with the company's history. So in 1984, Joe Mansueto founded Morningstar in his Chicago apartment. And the next year, he launched its ratings for mutual funds. At that point, a novel product. In the following decades, that Morningstar has basically gone from strength to strength. So in the past 20 years, the company's experienced tenfold growth in revenues, operating income, and the number of employees. And along the way, they've dramatically broadened their customer base, their global footprint, the line of products and services that they offer. And going forward, they're in a super interesting position. And what they're trying to do is basically continue to provide differentiated insights to investors, which they've been doing, since their inception, but increasingly leveraging AI. Making use of their operational scale, and the bit that got us so excited for this podcast, building an amazing culture. And according to our analysis, Morningstar already has an exceptional corporate culture. So as a lead up to our discussion, we analyzed more than 30,000 employee reviews on Glassdoor for 15 financial data and market exchange companies. And what we found was that Morningstar employees spoke about corporate culture much more frequently and much more positively than their counterparts in peer companies. So the way to read this chart is the horizontal axis is noting the percentage of employees in Glassdoor reviews who mentioned culture, and the vertical axis is how positively they mention culture. And again, we see Morningstar in the upper right quadrant. So Morningstar has a really amazing culture in general, but they focus on, in particular, on 5 core values. So champion the investor. So they're on the investor side, trying to arm the investor with better data to make better decisions. Dreaming big and driving change. So having the sense of ambition. A real focus on execution, which is something we're going to dig into later. Growth mindset, continually learning, and also one team. So the different parts of the organization work well with one another. And what's interesting about Morningstar is not only do employees rate the culture as a whole very high, they also, on the specific values that Morningstar aspires to, they rate the company highly. So if we look at growth mindset, for instance, one of the topics we measure with our tool is educational opportunities. So opportunities for employees to develop themselves. And again, the same plotting conventions as the last chart. And what we're seeing here, again, like we saw with Morningstar's overall culture, is employees are much more likely to talk about educational opportunities, the horizontal axis, and when they do talk about much more positively, much than their peers or their counterparts in peer organizations. So Morningstar is clearly delivering on that core value of growth mindset. Similarly, if we look at one team, something that bedevils many organizations, the ability for different parts of the organization, different teams, units, functions to work with one another, we see the same pattern here, where Morningstar employees, in this case, talk about it less, because in most cases, when employees talk about coordination across teams, which we call cross-silo, they're talking about it negatively typically. So the less they talk about it, the better in this case. And Morningstar employees are talking about it near the least of any of their peers, and again, talking about it much more positively. So what we'd like to do now is kind of dive in, Kunal, and understand a little bit about the origin of Morningstar's culture, how we'll really talk a little bit about how, given this great opportunity set you face right now in, at the intersection of AI, new investment opportunities, personalization, how your culture is helping you to position yourself to seize those opportunities and continue the great growth that Morningstar has enjoyed over the past decades. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about how you embed the culture in the company, especially as you've grown so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk on all those things, and feel free to loop me back to any piece that you feel like you want more detail on. But I think the roots of our culture really go back to when Joe started the company with the mindset that the idea was that not only are we going to be in the financial services business, but very specifically that we were going to be advocates for investors. And so from those early days all the way to today, I believe that that's differentiating, that people who walk in here believe that it's more than just a job, that we want to have success and create success, obviously, but we're doing it in a way that makes a difference for people's lives. And I remember when I came to Morningstar for the first time and I was leaving college, I had some opportunities, and what attracted me to Morningstar was the voice. In those days, the internet was still relatively new, and Morningstar had jumped on the internet, started Morningstar. Morningstar's web service in those days, and it's Morningstar.com today. It was Morningstar.net in those days. But I found the voice of our analysts to be so appealing, and that they called it like they saw it. And to this day, that independence permeates our ranks. And so there's a very strong challenger mentality at the core of our culture. This kind of mindset that there's nothing in our way when it comes to serving investors and empowering them and their success. And so I would just say that kind of permeates it, and this notion of always doing the right thing. And one of the things I'm always really proud of is that not only do we have a growth mindset, not only are we always thinking about what's next, but we do it in a way where everybody feels like we're not cutting any corners when it comes to how we do things. And that's a really important thing, I think, in financial services in particular, because as you know, financial services, probably outside of technology, has not been historically a very trusted sector. And so walking the walk in that context is incredibly important.
And which aspects of Morningstar's culture have helped the company spot and seize the opportunities that have fueled its growth?
Yeah, I think you touched on growth mindset and execution is everything. Those are really important ones. But I think part of it has also just been a willingness to look at who we're serving, i.e. investors, and think about them as our North Star, and think about what they're going to need to do to be successful, and for us to anticipate that and get there prior to them getting there. And so I'll give you a simple example. There was so much ink spilt over this notion of robo-advisors and whether they were going to take over the world or not take over the world. And lots of debate on it, lots of capital deployed. I think you can safely say that a lot of capital wasted in pursuit of robo-advisors. Yet what people forgot is like who you're doing it for and where can you meet them. And today, our retirement business, at its core, we're building portfolios for investors using technology. And we don't call it a robo-advisor, but fundamentally, we took the same technology that robo-advisors were taking and tried to put it in a context where investors could use it tangibly, i.e. their 401ks, and we've kind of grown that business. Or, thinking about the fact that private markets would likely become much more important to investors than it seemed like 10 years ago. So when we bought PitchBook 10 years ago, I think a lot of people weren't thinking that private markets would become part of the conversation in the way that they've become. And today, we think about the whole portfolio, including private markets, and not just public markets. And I think, we've had that ability in our culture because we have a challenger mentality. We have a mentality that we want to do things for investors in a way that sort of shakes up the norm, that it's allowed us to, make some of the choices that we've made. the other thing I'll just kind of point to is we do have a longer term mindset than most companies that are out there. So we went public in 2005, and we did an auction IPO. So when you talk about things that are important to culture, we put the investor first and make sure that investor has access to everything in an equitable way. And what did we do with our IPO? We did an auction IPO because we wanted every investor who cared to own Morningstar to have an equal chance. And so it was not about an investment bank running a book and kind of, maybe having a certain set of clients have better access to it than the average investor. And that's what we allowed for. And so to this day, even as a public company, we don't do any estimates. We don't talk to analysts on an ongoing basis. And so these kinds of things are really important in the context of who we are and how it shows up in our culture, because it reinforces that we're there for the long term and we're trying to build value for all our stakeholders in that capacity.
And how, an interesting aspect of Morningstar is you're so analyst heavy, right? You've got this independence and you have these folks who are, fantastic analysts. How do you build that sense of empathy with the customers and instill that, not say that analysts aren't naturally empathetic, but that's not typically
I
how
think that's what
think
you were
about their
saying.
role.
As an ex-analyst, I can say that we can be pretty wonky when we want to be. But you do that by understanding who your customers are and being aligned with them. And, I remember as an analyst myself, in those days, we used to have bulletin boards. Like, this is predating social media, and all the analysts would spend time on bulletin boards answering questions from investors. And it kind of gets you out of the ivory tower when you get close to your customers and understand what they're doing. And the easiest way to have a challenger mentality, have a mentality of trying to do the right thing for them, is to understand them and their needs and be aligned with the outcomes that they're going for. So Morningstar wins if the end investor wins, and the analysts here know that they are writing with the mindset of helping an investor, whether that investor is the largest pension fund in the world or an investor trying to build a retirement account or a college account for their child.
Speaking of long-term time horizon, you were there maybe 10 years before the company went public, back when it had maybe a tenth of how many employees it has now or less. How has the culture evolved during your tenure? What has stayed stable and what has changed?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just acknowledge it is really difficult to maintain a culture as you become bigger, and you have to be very much practiced and repetitive, and you have to embody the behaviors that matter. You can't just write it on the walls. Like, I've been into plenty of companies where you see the values on the wall, and then you ask folks who work there to explain what the values mean, and they just kind of mean a bunch of things to a bunch of people. I think that's not the case with us, and it's because we talk about it all the time. We try to live it. Something as simple as recruiting undergraduates into Morningstar. Even I participate in those interviews. And you might say, why is the CEO participating in undergraduate interviews? It's to send a message of the quality control we want to maintain and how we want to convey our culture really, really, even in the early stages of our hiring. And so the most important thing as we've tried to grow is how we've been deliberate as leaders here to make sure that we're passing the culture and embodying the culture and getting involved, in helping build our businesses in other parts of the world. And so you've often seen Morningstar leaders travel to different countries around the world to help open up those offices, or we've put people from, Chicago or Seattle or New York into our London office, or our offices in Australia, for example, in the early days, because it has really helped, embody that culture and kind of take it forward. So we do a lot of those types of things.
And when you're in those discussions with the undergraduates, for instance, I mean, what are the attributes that you're looking for? Obviously, the skill set, of course, but in terms of their values and how they're likely to fit into Morningstar, like what's the profile, assuming skills, of course, what's the profile of a candidate who's going to really thrive in Morningstar versus one who, for whom it might not be a great fit?
It's not necessarily a profile, but there's certainly some qualities that I think we lean towards, right? And so we like people who have shown persistence. We like people who have shown grit. We like people who have tangibly solved problems in college or prior to college. And we also just like people who demonstrate a commitment to learning. And so, we often have a saying here that we can teach you finance, but we can't teach you how to think. And so in a lot of our interviews, we're testing people for how they think. And it's partly why we end up with a lot of non-finance hires into Morningstar, because they're excellent thinkers and they're able to pick up the finance in a pretty easy way and combine that to do some really great things. And so we tend to hire candidates from all types of backgrounds.
And so you mentioned this, North Star of customer centricity and doing the right thing for the customer and challenging conventions. How do you think about changing the culture over time? Or is it just a North Star is a North Star and it'll always be a North Star? Or are there more adjustments to the culture as it evolves?
Yeah, the culture does change, but what doesn't change is generally the values that underpin that culture. And the reality is that different parts of the culture tend to appeal to different people for different reasons, but there are core pieces that should appeal to everybody. And so our independence, our long-term mindset, those kinds of things appeal to everybody. But as we've gotten bigger, for example, as we've done acquisitions, we've tried to look at the firms that we're bringing in and see what do they do well, and what are the things that we can learn from them and try to embody. And so, for example, execution is everything has not been a value that has existed since the dawn of Morningstar. It's something that we've added on in the past decade as the company's become bigger, both because we've seen that value kind of deployed successfully at some of the firms that we've acquired, as well as the fact that we want to make sure that as we become bigger, we don't sort of lose our entrepreneurial roots and kind of have that hustle mentality that has sort of existed, throughout, what's happened here at Morningstar. So we've tried to do that as well. And then, just the candid answer is we also just try to have some fun. I think it's a really important part of our culture. We don't call it out, but I think you want to stay loose, and I think you don't want to take yourself too seriously all the time. And so we try to have a fun culture, and that includes making fun of the CEO from time to time. And I've been the subject of many targeted jokes. Actually, execution is everything is a value I love to talk about. And so last year, an internal video was created about me talking about execution is everything in different situations, and they just totally made fun of me in a town hall because of it. But like that's the kind of thing we want to do. But again, the point was made that value is so important to the organization, even in a moment of levity. So cultures change and evolve because obviously you want to stay relevant, but the core values generally kind of bind you together.
And are there any things that you're focused in on right now in the spirit of, the core values staying stable, but the culture continuously evolving? Are there things that, with, for instance, the adoption of AI or, the kind of explosion in private debt, are any of those kind of macro changes leading the team to think about the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think a willingness to drive change. Part of when you were telling that story, I mean, the reality is like more than half our business today didn't exist a decade ago. We were not in those lines, and we kind of went into those lines and have grown businesses in those spaces because we've been willing to make some bets and willing to think about things differently than what our history might have suggested, and that continues to be really important. I think a willingness to just hustle and kind of get things done. Execution is everything, and growth mindset are incredibly important and are things that we're trying to kind of continue preserving and emphasizing. I started this company when there were about 200 of us, and we all did everything and we all try to get it done now. And I can tell you that I don't walk into any meeting today where I'm not pushing people to get things done faster than they think they're going to get it done. And one of the reasons for that is because you can very easily kind of fall back otherwise and start to think that you have infinite timelines and infinite resources just because you're bigger. And really the reality is like small teams execute well, small teams hustle, and the shorter the timeline, the more motivated people are to go get after things. And so kind of creating that mindset of like actually shipping things and getting them done is really, really important, because I think the more people have a sense of achievement, the more they feel convicted in the work that they're doing.
And let's dig into that a little bit, because I want to kind of shift gears now and talk about the. I mean, it's interesting. Morningstar is in a very interesting place, right? Because you've got all these new investment opportunities for folks, which are the private markets, as you mentioned. People didn't, when you bought PitchBook, people probably didn't anticipate how prevalent private markets would be for investments. AI obviously is shifting, interface with customers, analysis of data, collection of data, everything that you're doing is being touched by AI. And obviously there are macroeconomic trends and other things going on as well. So, you're in a really interesting spot. And, a company that's combining financial information and data analytics. It's just like if you basically throw in every sexy buzzword, that's where Morningstar lands. And so, just a great opportunity set arises out of that. So I'd love to dig into some of the aspects of the culture and execution. And let's start where you just had us, which is, fighting complacency, right? Because Morningstar is now, you probably remember it as the scrappy days of 200, but other people look outside, they say like, this is a tremendously successful, big company. So what are some of the concrete things that you and the team are able to do to maintain that, that sense of hustle and grit and urgency?
Yeah. So a couple of things that are important in our culture. One is we're a very decentralized organization. And part of the inspiration for being decentralized is to make sure that people own the outcomes that they're charged with driving. And we tend to push down accountability in our organization. So for example, even when it comes to bonus plans, we allow a large percentage of how bonus plans are set to be driven by the performance of our business units in the business unit you're in. And allow that to be the primary factor, even though there's a company-wide factor as well. So there's kind of a desire to just make sure that accountability is held at that level. We've also really tried to push a lot of what I'll call our central services into the business units and create less dependencies around, what I'll call centralized resources. We certainly have centralized resources like other organizations do, but, we keep trying to push whatever we can into the business units so that the accountability is at that level. But by the same token, from a centralized perspective, our CFO, our strategy group, our mandate is to challenge and kind of get the business units moving and to ensure that they are not being complacent themselves. And so we have a mechanism as well, just through our planning process, where we tend to push quite a bit in terms of what's expected and how folks, kind of deliver from that perspective. But in general, the strategy is to drive accountability down to every individual in the organization to the extent that it's possible.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe could you expand a little bit on this, the kind of mechanism for pushing on the teams, right? Because I think a lot of leaders are going to be hearing this and saying like, that's what I need more of that. Right. I need our teams to, have a greater sense of urgency or a greater, ambition or whatever it is. Like what are some like tactical recommendations you would make to leaders who are saying like, I want to be doing more of what Morningstar's doing?
One of the most practical things I think that happens is it's always easier for people to think about what can go wrong. And I whenever I talk to other business leaders or I look at projects that seem like a stretch, generally you will get like pages and pages of reasons why it could go wrong. And one of the things I've tried to do is orient our teams to be aware of that, but to be focused on what it's going to take to get things done, as opposed to just getting paralyzed by the blockers. And I think it's a really good and difficult exercise in many instances. But once you make that pivot and you really get people focused on the art of the possible and how you kind of create that, I think it's a lot more rewarding and likely that you will get the outcomes that you want. And so, over time, that's a pivot I've really tried to make, is I always ask the question of, tell me what it's going to take, not just why it can't be done. And I think it's a very simple statement probably, but a really, I think, nuanced way to get more out of your teams. Second thing is to be unafraid to push. Like, that's just the reality. Part of being a good leader is to not accept something that you feel is substandard or not fast enough or not good enough. And I very rarely will go into a meeting and come out without pushing on timelines, without pushing on quality, without pushing on the cost of delivery. And so you could say, well, people are going to expect that. That's fine. Yet, if I don't do it, I don't think they're pushing often enough by themselves. And I think that's kind of the role of a leader, is to be that demanding. And I think you can have a great culture, but within that culture, you can be competitive and demanding. And so I like to think that we do all the things right when it comes to creating a great culture, but part of that culture needs to be a winning mentality. And you get that winning mentality by pushing, and it feeds on itself, because good cultures come from winning cultures. And people want to be on a winning team. And so we haven't really talked about that up to this point, but it is so important to be on a winning team and to feel like you're winning, to have a great culture. And part of the reason I think we've been successful is because people walk in here every day knowing that they have an opportunity to create a win or many wins. And that's what we're working towards. And a big part of my job is to make sure that that is something people believe in, and that we create the structure and provide the support for that to happen.
And if I could just dig a little bit more into this, because I know this is going to be something, a lot of executives are really interested in. The mechanism that most organizations use for this kind of teams making commitments, and then, the kind of give and take and the pushback from leaders, is goals. And I know from listening to another podcast that you on, that you use goals internally, OKRs or some variant
Yeah, we
thereof.
do.
And so, like, a lot of Charlie and I have written and done a bunch of research on OKRs and goals. And what you see is basically everybody uses them. 95% of all large organizations have some goal system in place. And despite that, there's huge variance in terms of their effectiveness in driving execution, maintaining a sense of urgency, building and reinforcing the kind of culture that you want. So, are there any things that you and your team focus on in managing goals in order to, kind of build this culture and this momentum and maintain this kind of grit and hustle?
Yeah. So when we went to OKRs, I think the reality is, you summed it up correctly, that across the organization, adoption of OKRs was differently team by team, was done differently team by team. And we've pushed very hard in the subsequent years to make it so that it's consistent across the organization. Are we perfect? No. Have we made good progress? I would say yes. And it starts by being very top down and transparent about expectations. So every year, every quarter, we run a process where every group will do their KRs, and they get fed back up to me by the strategy team. And there's a period of feedback and back and forth on what they need to be before we set them. And then we put them on our internal intranet called the Pond for transparency to anyone in the organization. So everybody knows what every group's KRs are and what they're signing up for. And then we also put whether they achieve them or not transparently onto our intranet. And so I think there's some good pressure in doing that. And then the second thing is how each of us as leaders in the organization deal with them. So I've just completed my mid-year check-ins, reviews, whatever you want to call them, with those who report to me. And it was a KR based conversation. So it was not like, I think you did like this or this. Like, it was like, no, here's what you signed up for. And let's go through and see where you are tracking to them. And let's talk about what you want to do in the second half of the year. And so we just try to talk in the language and be very disciplined around just repeating ourselves and following through on it. And so part of making them successful is actually using them, and as a leader, talking about them publicly. And so we do that, and I think we've gotten better at it as a result. But for sure, we have work to do to get to an even better level.
And one of the key tensions with OKRs and goals in general is, on the one hand, you want ambition, right? You want people to make ambitious goals, because in the spot you're in with all the interesting things going on, you really need people to be ambitious and not be thinking too incrementally. On the other hand, if you're holding them responsible and accountable for delivery, it's just human nature to maybe not sandbag, but to
Sandbag away. People love
okay, or maybe sandbag, make commitments that you're comfortable.
You always got to be on the lookout for sandbagging. But here's what I would tell you. I think you always want to have ambition, but you want to have ambition in your long-term plans, and you want to set those in a way that feel difficult, yet achievable. With the KRs, we're getting down to what we're doing every quarter. And so every quarter is a step towards achieving that 3-year plan. And I think you need to be realistic as to what needs to get done in a quarter. And you need to be super ambitious in the 3-year plan, if that makes sense to you. And so we try to set it so that what is being delivered in the quarter is appropriately ambitious as it pertains to where we want to get to in the 3 years, but it's realistic and achievable. Whereas we build a lot more stretch into what our 3-year plan looks and feels like when we're building those.
Yeah, I think that's probably the only way you can do it. I mean, to kind of strike that balance and maintain a real focus on execution. Because if you try to be crazily, delusionally ambitious in the quarter, it's just the system.
It's also important not to penalize people when they are overly ambitious and they don't get to an outcome. I think the key thing there is like to have an honest reflection on why something wasn't achieved and whether the way we're forecasting we're going to get work done makes sense or not, or whether we missed. And often it's because like the work wasn't executed as well, and so then you want to make another go at it. But you want to make sure people are appropriately stretching.
Yeah, and let's come back to this point about candid discussion. So, I just think it's so funny that Morningstar has 40% roughly of your employees are analysts. A lot of my students are analysts. So I have a view of very super quantitative, super critical thinking.
Very debate heavy conversation.
Debate heavy, right? Exactly. That's kind of their. So one thing is, how do you think that the prevalence of analysts in Morningstar and the origin of Morningstar has shaped the norms of discussions around things like, we didn't hit our OKRs, what happened? Or we were trying to do this and it didn't work out the way we expected. Like, how, has that kind of shaped how conversations take place, and difficult conversations in particular?
I mean, I think there's no doubt that some of us who came up, and that includes me, through the analyst ranks, by nature are more comfortable with public debate, because that's our training, and that's sort of the way we kind of learn to apply the trade, so to speak, and so it kind of comes with that. But I think with others, I think the biggest risk that people often fear is like upsetting somebody else. And I often say that at the end of the day, even if someone is upset in the moment, if you're giving critical feedback, they will come back and thank you at some point, as long as the feedback was actionable and fair. And look, nobody likes tough feedback. Even to this day, I mean, when I get tough feedback, and I do, it could be a customer complaining about something, it could be someone on a board making a comment. It's not easy to absorb it, but you have to create the space mentally to reflect on it and then come back and react to it. And I think it's learned through practice, candidly. And you got to have a toolkit that allows you for that. But in our culture, we do allow for a fair amount of debate. We do allow for people to publicly challenge the management team. In fact, while we don't do earnings calls and things like that externally, as soon as we release earnings every quarter, we have an internal town hall where everybody can ask us questions. Once a month, I do a town hall called Ask Kunal Everything. Ask Kunal Anything, not everything, AKA. And people get to ask me whatever's on their minds. And a lot of people ask really tough, pointed questions. And I think that comes from the culture of having folks who have grown up with a critical thinking mindset, which we really prize.
And just on this point of toolkits, like, is there, again, as you've grown and as you've added, well, of course, you've always had non-analysts, but as you have other employees who don't have that analyst training and that analyst, approach to applying their trade, are there specific tools or training that you found or techniques that as an organization you found helpful for enabling people or making it easier for people to have these discussions that, as you rightly note, are often difficult?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is for any organization, the senior leadership team and their behaviors are the ones that people respond to or mimic. And if as senior leaders, we display the right type of attitude when it comes to being challengers, when it comes to, appropriately debating, I think it flows down the organization. If we are defensive, if people are asking me questions on the Ask Kunal anything every month and I'm defensive about it, I think it sets a kind of defensive tone for everybody else in the organization when they're asked that way. And so one of the most important things about culture is that the leaders have to embody it first and foremost. And one of the reasons I love Morningstar is because of the culture. And so I'm a culture carrier as much as anyone else on the leadership team. And on any of the topics you've highlighted today, how we do is as important as what we say we're going to do. And so people are watching and responding to that. And if you do the right thing and, you approach these topics with a level of transparency and candor, usually is something that the organization also starts to embody.
And that must shape how you think about who gets promoted to leadership positions throughout, at the business unit level and then at corporate as well.
Absolutely. You have to, among other things, be someone who embodies our culture appropriately and is willing to kind of be a culture carrier. You're setting the tone for the organization if you're on the senior leadership team.
Great. And, just one other type of tough discussion that I'd love to get your take on is when you try something new and it never works according to plan and anywhere, right? That's just nature trying, and sometimes things don't work at all. The challenge that a lot of organizations have is they want to pursue new opportunities, they want to innovate, they want to be agile, but they really struggle, not so much in personal feedback, but in the discussions about, wow, this isn't working and why isn't it working? How do you, as a leader, as a team, as an organization, how do you think about making it easier for people to talk about things that aren't working quickly enough to fix them?
Yeah, it's hard because people's natural inclination is to rush to you with good news and try not to talk about the bad news. And so, again, the system of KRs is actually really helpful in this context because there's transparency into what's happening across the organization, and it becomes a very tangible way to see why some things are not hitting in the way that they otherwise might. And so I at least personally try to use them as a way to look at some of our up and coming initiatives and see if they're tracking or not, and then to kind of create the space for having that conversation. I think within any organization, you always want to be planting a few seeds and watering them, but some of them are going to grow into weeds, and it's fine to pull them out very quickly because you only want to, after a period, be watering a few to the next stage, if that makes sense, giving sunlight to a few of them, right? And so at different stages of investment, you got to be able to do that. And if there's not a system of candor, a system of KRs to evaluate those, it becomes problematic. So I think being less subjective being less subjective is important, and allows you to kind of make those types of decisions.
And again, it must help, having so many analytically oriented people, right? So you're giving them concrete data about this is what we committed to, and this is, these are the measures, and here's how we're actually doing. So
it does help. It certainly helps. Yeah.
And with this data analytical perspective, how do you get reliable metrics about everything we've been talking about today? How do you measure culture in a company with 11,000 employees reliably?
Yeah, we have internal surveys that we do just like everybody else. We used to do them more frequently, but we've shifted now to two internal surveys every 6 months. Um, we call them engagement surveys, sentiment surveys, whatever you'd like to call them. And what we do is we are very transparent with them. So we share results with every team lead as to what it looks like on their team and kind of move that up through the organization. And so it's very transparent and easy to see where are we doing well, what are the spots that we have some weaknesses, and then the conversation starts at the executive team level. We look at the results, we even share them with our board, and we note what's changing, where we might have some weak spots, where we might need to make some adjustments. So these kinds of things are concrete and they do end up mattering a lot. And again, the transparency around it is super important. And so if certain things change, we talk about them in our town halls and acknowledge them and say what we're going to do to try to change them. That type of feedback and transparency is incredibly important.
Great. You mentioned learning from some of your acquisitions, and you've had PitchBook, DBRS, Sustainalytics, others. Like how in the past when you've thought about acquisitions, or looking forward when you think about acquisitions, how do you think about the role of culture? Like, are you looking for a
It's
cultural
huge.
fit? Yeah.
It's huge. I mean, it's hard to say you're looking for cultural fit perfectly because everybody says that. I think we're looking at least at a base level with people who have mindsets that will get them excited about our culture. Because ultimately they are being absorbed into our culture and they've got to be excited about that. Otherwise, you're likely to have issues down the road. Now, it's much easier when you know the individuals who are involved and you have a relationship prior to the acquisition to kind of get aligned on that. And we've had the opportunity to do that in some cases. But there are other cases where there's an auction situation and you maybe don't get to know the other organization well. And what you do in those situations is you show up to be transparent about your organization, i.e., what Morningstar is like, and you see how they react and what that does for them. And it's interesting. I think we have a really good reputation from a cultural perspective. And so we particularly get calls from people who care about the future of the organizations that they've built and they want to see it in good hands. And those kinds of folks will call us and try to see if there's a fit before they go into a process. And that I think says a lot about culture as well as um, the way you can set yourself up for success because you're going to automatically get some pull demand from like-minded individuals and cultures.
Great. And in a kind of a similar vein in terms of acquiring talent, one way is through acquisitions, another through hiring. I mean, you're right at the Venn diagram of data analytics and finance, like two of the fiercest battlegrounds for talent there are right now. What's the pitch that Morningstar makes to, a talented young college graduate or, CFA, whatever the candidate might be? Like, how do you, and what really ends up resonating? Like, who are,
Yeah.
what do you hear from the candidates say, like,
So one
that's
of the things we
what brought
find
me?
is that a lot of the pitching is done by our colleagues around the world. And you started by citing what was on Glassdoor, and we haven't told anyone to go put that stuff up on Glassdoor, but they have. And that kind of, endorsement is worth its weight in gold. Because it's not me or anybody else saying that. It's my rank and file colleagues, and I think it carries a lot of weight. But I think we're also candid about the type of organization we are, that the mission matters, that growth really matters to us, that we like self-starters, that we like people who have a long-term mentality. And we're not looking for people who just want to flip careers and kind of jump around and look for the next big thing. And so when you're here and you're interviewing, you probably get interviewed by more people than you would at other organizations. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we want different people to get a look at you and to spend some time thinking about, how you could contribute here and be successful here. And it's really helpful not just to have the view of one or two people, but people you might interact with more broadly, which is why we try to have more senior people involved in interviews at different levels of the organization, regardless of who's getting hired.
So stepping back, what advice would you give to the CEO of a company that doesn't have a very strong culture if they want to build a strong culture?
Well, the first thing I would say is it takes persistence, and it takes intentionality, and it takes time. And so those things are really important. And then you set the pace yourself on it, and your executive team is with you in that journey. And so a culture is only going to be as good as the person leading the organization allows it to be and how they embody it. And the job of a CEO, among other things, is to embody the culture and set the pace. And so to someone who's trying to bring change or pick a new direction or reinforce a culture in a particular way, start talking about it, start embodying it, and make it real. I think that's what matters. It shouldn't just be on the walls. It should be in your actions, in your words. And you'll be surprised as to how quickly people start to come along on that journey with you. And avoid the jargon. Like, don't sound like everybody else. That's the other thing I would say. It's really easy to sound like everybody else, and you want to do something authentic to your culture.
Yeah, just one element that I keep coming back to, and you've mentioned probably half a dozen times here, is around development and this importance of people developing. And so, how, um, obviously you're selecting for that. You've talked about that, but how do you, especially when things are changing very quickly and there's a lot, there's AI and there's new asset classes and all these things going on. Like, how do you ensure that people remain excited and engaged and, hungry for that development? Because, in
I
a
think
lot
it's tied to growth. Growth creates opportunity for everybody. And many great careers, in our organization have been built because growth has created unexpected opportunities for people. And so whenever I'm asked about how to build a career here or the things someone ought to do, I always tell people to take chances and do things that they think that they may not have an interest in, because that's where unexpected growth comes from. That's where accelerated growth comes from. And I think, like any good culture, has people who are experts in certain fields, and then there are generalists who are willing to move around and support those experts. And we have a really good mix of both. And I think ultimately there's a base recognition here that business does change, investors do change, and we need to keep experimenting and be willing to change with those times. And it's an easy thing to say, it's a very difficult thing to do. And so we try to do it not only in the way we speak, but in the way we plan, in the way we allocate resources, and in the expectations we set for people in different parts of our business.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point around this as a source of agility as well, to have people who are excited about, pursuing these new opportunities when they arise, as opposed to, kind of sticking within their
The art of the
narrative.
possible.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, Kunal, again, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground today. Reflecting on our discussion, is there anything that we should have talked about that you think we haven't talked about?
I think you covered a lot of good ground, and I would just say that culture is one of those things that probably is the hidden force in how a lot of companies create a lot of value over time. And I think we've done a lot of things right at Morningstar to become the company we are today and the company we hope to be in the future. But culture has been one of the ingredients that has allowed us to be successful, and I think will continue to allow us to be successful. And so, if you're a leader in any organization, being deliberate about culture, how you embrace it, how you talk about it, how you embody it, can be a difference maker.
Terrific. Well, thank you again so much, Kunal, for sharing your insights into Morningstar's outstanding culture. And thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.